And of course, my screen just went blank. Welcome. So I know that everybody is really excited to welcome Lyn. I have had discussions with Lyn in the past. Harley is particularly excited. The internal Slack channel at Simplify has been all about finally, I get some backup in my inflation arguments. What Harley doesn't know is that Lyn has turned deflationist on us.
Mike, do you want to, usually I dress more formally. Do you want to know why I'm wearing this special shirt today?
Because you wanted to look like a clown.
We're having an inflation party and you weren't invited.
Oh, that would explain why I am buying stuff at retail on clearance prices for the first time in 2 years. This is very exciting. Lyn, thank you so much for joining us. While I tease Harley, we're actually great friends. And there's nothing I enjoy more than a spirited debate, as you know. So thank you for joining us. And I actually wanted to make sure that I gave you props because you were one of the first to come out with the general theme that this could very much look like a wartime economy coming out of the Great Depression and into the dynamics of the 1940s. I wanted to kind of get just a very quick introduction to what brought you to that thought process. What were you focused on that was leading you in that direction?
So thanks for having me. My original inspiration for that was Ray Dalio's long-term debt cycle thesis, which is basically the premise that you have these shorter-term cycles, but then they build up leverage in the system. So you don't clear out each one. You kind of build up to higher and higher debt levels, lower interest rates, and then at the end of that cycle, you get a much bigger thing, generally currency devaluation. And so I recreated that data. I looked into the raw data going back 100 years, 150 years, recreated it, looked at it, I looked at his charts, but then I also recreated those charts. I looked at it from other angles. And I said, what about this angle? What about this angle? And I kind of confirmed that I think that is one of the more helpful frameworks, that we're going into. And he's kind of used that comparison that if you chart it out the way he has and that my versions have, you see that the 2010s in many ways are very similar to the 30s. With the great financial crisis being rather similar to the 1929 crash and the aftermath. And then the 2020s were shaping up to look a lot like the 1940s, and that this was coming out to look like a wartime economy, which is generally a fiscal-driven inflation, which is very different than the more common, when people think of inflation, they think of the 70s, which is very bank lending driven. And so my view is that, we have to go back further than that to find similar events. But of course, when you go back that far, there's all these differences. So I keep using the phrase that, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. So it's a helpful period to be familiar with. And then people can, once they're familiar with it, they can go out and then see what's different, what's the same, and go from there.
And so if you were to think about what's kind of broadly going on in this framework, what is the, other than the historical analogy to this is how these cycles work, one of the things I've struggled with in the comparison to the 1930s has been the underlying structurally very different feature of continued widening wealth disparity, et cetera, that we did not see in the 1930s, for example, right? That the 1930s saw a significant decline in household debt that's similar to what we saw through the very beginning part of the 2010s, but that's largely reversed itself, particularly on a global basis. If we look at Chinese households, et cetera, in particular, it's quite different. So when you think about that type of dynamic, is it just it doesn't repeat, but it rhymes framework, or is there something different that's going on this cycle that would suggest that, other than, of course, it's seeming to follow a period of, global relatively slow growth, certainly not what I would describe as a global depression as we had in the 1930s, but what do you see as similar and distinct in this cycle that could lead you to think about it as this would be confirmation, or I'm looking for something very, very different?
So the similar parts is that first you have a private debt bubble collapse. So you build up a huge private debt bubble and then that collapses. And then you have this kind of long period of stagnation, disinflation, rising populism and discontent. And then that, in back then it led into that populism around the world is partly what contributed to the war happening. And here we have populism. We headed into, the COVID lockdowns and the stimulus thereafter. And part of why there was so much stimulus in this environment, a pandemic aside, is how leveraged the system was. If this was a more resilient and less leveraged system, probably less stimulus would have been applied to it. Whereas because we're in that kind of long-term debt cycle phase, I think that's why part of why we got such a gigantic impulse that, when you're this leveraged, recessions and disruptions become a lot more, they become a lot bigger than they otherwise would be. Where you get a difference, I mean, if you look back in the 30s, a lot of it is a matter of degree, right? So back then you had an actual contraction in money supply. There was no FDIC insurance. That bubble unwound a lot further than this one did. And this one, they kind of kept it alive. They basically created money to offset some of the loan destruction that was occurring. So if you looked at broad money supply this time, M2, back in the 2008 crisis, you barely know anything big happened. If you're just looking at money supply, broad money supply, all the changes happened on, base money. And you kind of had basically contracting loans offset by minor stimulus, which, I mean, back then it was pretty big stimulus, but I mean, compared to what happened later, it was minor. Whereas back in the 30s, you actually had, outright bank failures, you far more of them. And that whole thing unwound so much further. So actually, wealthy people lost quite a bit of money. And then when you went into the 40s, the stimulus was also a little bit uh, more conducive to the working middle class, because as terrible as war was, most of the spending ends up actually being domestic. I mean, we think of wars as foreign things, and they are. I mean, we're wasting equipment and lives overseas, but you're building factories, you're paying soldiers when they come back. They didn't repeat what they did after World War I, which is basically give people a bus ticket and say thanks. They actually did the GI Bill. They put people through technical school and college and helped with homes and things like that. So there's kind of a very bottom-up type of stimulus, effectively, at least for those lucky enough to return from the war. Whereas here, when we did stimulus, some of it was very bottom-up, things like stimulus checks and things like child care tax credits, but there are also things like PPP loans that turn into grants. They were corporate bailouts. And so this was kind of bailing out the whole stack rather than kind of bottom-up. It was kind of top-down and bottom-up. So at first you had a K-shaped recovery. Now we're getting some labor response as well. So I think overall the policies were just less labor friendly in this cycle, and that contributed to it.
Mike, you might want to pull up Lynn's slide number 2 to go look at that flow.
I'm gonna pull up a couple of slides here. Give me
And
a
then
second.
Lynn, while he's doing that, the question I had is, are you comparing 1929 to 2008 or to like yesterday? Because truth be told, it looks a lot more like what we're happening now is 2000 or 1929. I mean, and the wealth disparity is cresting right now, or has just crested, as opposed to in 08. So, I mean, I'd almost say we're going into a 1930 scenario of sorts, notwithstanding, I mean, I say the war and all.
This is, you wanted to look at slide number 11, is that correct?
No, our slide number 2 of
Slide
our
number 2.
final version is she has a 5-year rolling money supply. I think she was referring to that, her broad money number. Lynn, is that what you want to use?
Yeah, that one works for broad money.
So I'm actually looking at this. I don't have the 5-year
Okay.
rolling broad money.
No,
I don't see that.
we'll figure it out. Let's go on.
Yeah. So to answer your prior question, I find that there were a lot of similarities between the global financial crisis of 2008 and the 1929 crash, because that was essentially the private debt bubble unwinding. Whereas what we're seeing now, what is kind of the aftermath of that. And so now we're in more of a public debt bubble, you could call it, both in when you go overseas, you look in Japan and Europe, but also here in the United States. And it's also where we are in the commodity capex cycle. I mean, in the 1930s, you generally went through a long period of, kind of commodity price stagnation, because of course you had less demand for most of those commodities. And again, in the 2010s, especially the second half of them, we had generally weaker commodity prices because we had this period of oversupply and less demand. Whereas when you look at the charts now, the sheer level of the deficits we just had for the past 2 years, the amount of broad money supply increase, the sheer amount that the base money went up, starts to look a lot more like wartime financing. So that's the kind of the comparison I made. But again, there are some differences. So wealth concentration, as you point out, is very high in this period. And so we've not even begun to address some of the things that are causing all this rising populism.